Hi, I'm Angela Fair. Today I'm going to show you how I paint Calypso orchids in my signature loose and fluid watercolor style. Once upon a time, I thought my destiny was to be a botanical artist, and over the years I've discovered that I get much more of a thrill out of painting expressively, a little bit abstract, and definitely showcasing the beauty of fluid and organic watercolor. I want to show you how I interpret a reference photo to create a flower painting that shows the beauty of the flower and the beauty of watercolor, and just is a lot of fun to paint. So we're going to do that. Before we start, if you're interested in learning more about how I paint loosely and fluidly, I have well over 100 tutorial videos here on YouTube, and I post new content almost weekly. So it's hit the subscribe button down in the bottom corner of the video, and then we'll move on and start painting. Also hang around at the end of the video because I'm sharing a special interactive painting event starting on October 1st that you're going to want to hear about if you are interested in painting lovely loose florals in watercolor and bridging that gap between detail and self-expression. So let's get started. We're going to have some fun painting Calypso orchids today and thinking about loose floral painting style. Calypso orchids are an orchid that grows wild around in my area, and so every now and then I'm lucky enough to stumble across one when I'm walking in the forest. And when I look at a Calypso orchid, I start thinking about how complicated it is. It has this lovely bulbous shape, and then the spray of little, I don't know, spiky petals that comes out of the top. And so that can feel kind of complicated to paint. And the good news is that when you're painting in a loose and fluid style, you don't have to paint every detail, and you certainly don't have to paint every detail flawlessly in order to make your flowers come to life. In fact, I love painting a suggestive floral style that holds back some of the detail and gives the viewer the chance to use their imaginations. So I'm going to, right now, I'm just exploring the outer shapes of my Calypso orchid with some negative painting. I'm painting around the orchid rather than painting the orchid itself. And you can see I'm getting those spiky bits. I've got the bulbous, rounded throat of the orchid, and I have a number of reference photos in front of me. It's nice to use kind of more than one so that you can improvise. And so some of those are showing me 3 petals, some are showing me 4 kind of spiking out of the top, and I think some of it depends on the angle, and some of it might depend on the variety as well. So that gives me a little bit of freedom as well to find my way there. And I'm just working with green gold and a nice round Escoda Versatile brush. This is a number 10 round. And this green gold made by Daniel Smith has this lovely flow as I add water. I've worked with fairly strong saturations of pigment here, so that when I add water I have lots of pigment willing to kind of move and flow across the page. So suddenly I have the very beginning shapes of an orchid, or could be any number of flowers really. And I've also got the beginnings of my background painted because I used negative painting. And I'm actually seeing kind of the beginning shape over here, just a hint of what could become a second orchid. And we're just going to give that a little room for possibility, just with a slight curve there, and then just leave it be for now. And I'm going to go to my Rose of Ultramarine, which is a gorgeous hue from Daniel Smith, and I think really it has a nice sense of the colors I'm seeing in my orchid. The Rose of Ultramarine also plays really nicely with the green gold, and it has a quality where it separates as it starts to dry. Now, because I'm painting this in my first layer with that nice juicy amount of pigment on my brush, you can see that the little spiky petals that I'm painting are bleeding into the green gold, and I actually want that to happen because I'm working on a loose floral. I want that suggested shape rather than rigid detail. And look at how pretty that is as it starts to flow and bleed. Because I also did take my time, so this was the first thing I painted was around those petal shapes, and so because I didn't immediately go in with my Rose of Ultramarine, you're seeing that the color's not, it is bleeding, but it's not bleeding tons. So I have a little bit of kind of breathing room, a little bit of time. I let that green gold soak in, and then I came back and started adding in my violet colors. And I've grabbed a little bit of lavender, another Daniel Smith color, and that lavender is going to form the cup of my flower right now. So right there I have the very beginnings of an orchid, and it's very soft and suggested. Now what's going to happen when you're painting loosely in watercolor is, especially if you're working with a reference photo, is you're going to see the reference photo and you're going to start to feel like you need to add details. You're going to go, well, there's some speckles in there in the flower itself, and there's some yellow that form the throat of the flower as well, and I need to add in all these details and all these colors. And as soon as you start feeling rigidly tied to that, your painting starts looking a little stiff and overworked. And so knowing that we have some freedom, oh, it's just so pretty to let that color flow and play. And knowing that we can let watercolor be beautiful as our first priority can be freeing when you're working with a reference photo. And I talk about this, I talk about using reference photos as tools a lot in my online classes, because the reference photo shouldn't be our master. We should be able to let go and improvise and be playful. And sometimes that means forgetting everything the reference photo tells you and just going with what feels right for the painting in that moment. So I'm just playing with a little bit of additional color here. I want to give the look of additional flowers, but I don't want to paint every detail of this huge clump of flowers. I want to have some softness and some movement and some freedom here. I'm going to go back to my green gold right now. And so far I've really only worked with two colors. The Rose of Ultramarine is actually made up of multiple pigments. It's, I believe, a quinacridone rose and ultramarine blue. And so it actually, I'm actually using three colors, even though it only looks like two, because that blue and the rose start to separate as they dry, and they create some really beautiful effects. There's this huge puddle down here. I know you can see that. As I'm working, I'm tilting my board. That's why I'm holding it with my right hand. And that's giving me a little bit of gravity flow that gives, makes everything move downward, keeps the color from puddling back into my flower shapes. And I'm going to zoom in just a second so you can see some of the pretty things that are happening. Because I'm using a good quantity of pigment, my brush was quite heavily pigmented when I placed it on the paper. You could actually see beads of pure pigment right in this area here. And that pure pigment is what gives my color power. And sometimes if your colors are feeling a little weak, maybe you just need a little more pigment to water ratio on your paintbrush. I'm going to actually put something under my board so I don't have to tilt it anymore. I just leaning it up against a plastic container. And we'll take a second to evaluate here. Now I'm hesitant to go in. I want to put some background color in this area here. But I don't want to, I like the crispness and the contrast that this petal creates compared to these softer ones. So I'm going to wait to put that green gold in until these petals have dried. I can still create a wet and wet look, but it will be a little more intentional and controlled than if I were to try to position it now. As my color starts to flow, I think something that really interesting is happening. I'm actually working with a triad of colors. I'm working with the green gold, which is like a yellow. It's on the yellower side of green. And then my Rose of Ultramarine, as I said, has a pink and it has a blue in it. So I'm actually working with those three primary colors in my color wheel. And that means I'm getting a peachy color where the color is flowing down and mixing together. Little hints of that quinacridone rose and the green gold mixing to make a peachy hue. I can see it again in here. So I'm getting some really beautiful and lovely subtle transitions of color. I'm also getting some interesting watermarks, and if you can see right in here, there's a lovely little tendrils of water just pushing against the color that's there, and that's creating texture that looks a lot like the veins in the orchid itself. So that's one of those wonderful watercolor magic things that you can't always predict or plan for, but by working in a fluid style, you give opportunities for those magical things to happen. And we're going to be making some more magic after this first layer dries. I'm kind of at the stage where I want to stop. I'm at the stage where I want to stop, and I'll tell you why. If I were to keep painting, a couple things are going to start to happen. I'm just softening some edges here before I set this down to dry. I'm going to leave these little areas because they look kind of like stems or leaves. But over here I'm going to add some water so that I don't get an edge where some of the color's moving away from the most saturated part of the painting. And by adding a little more water than you think you need, you give that color room to flow right to the edge of the page, avoiding those harsh lines. Now, two reasons I'm stopping right now. One is that I really like the freshness that I have right here. I know that the longer that I paint, the more likely it is that I'm going to put down a brush stroke that's not going to serve the painting well. I also notice alongside of that my body starts to tighten up as I paint, and my hand, which was loose on my brush, you know, kind of holding it in the middle, starts to choke up. And when my fingers move down to the brush bristles, I know that I'm working in detail, wanting to really control the brush. And at this stage of the painting, I don't want to overwork or obsess about detail. I want to focus on the overall painting and those basic shapes and colors. And because details happen in the later stages of the painting, that's another reason why it's a good time to stop. If I were to start trying to add details now, little flecks of color into the center of my orchids and so forth, I'd start to see some blotchiness happen as the painting's getting to that point of no return stage. Over here we've got some shiny moisture still where I could maybe still add paint. Here my painting is near dry, but still a little bit damp. And I actually have this edge that's created because there was an imbalance of moisture here. This area is quite a bit wetter than this area. I actually like that edge, so I haven't done anything to try to erase it or move it, but I'm always watching for things like that so that I can fix them if necessary before the painting gets too dry to really make changes to. When I come back to the painting, I'm going to look for places to add maybe some stems and leaves. I'm going to put in that background like I mentioned, and give some more fluid color opportunities. I want an overall wet and wet look, so that will be my goal throughout the painting. I'm so eager to paint this that I almost can't wait till it's completely dry. I've got some bubbles, ripples over here, which indicate to me that it's still a little damp in this area, and towards the bottom where the water, of course, all flowed down is going to be the last area to dry. But this area is definitely dry enough for me to start playing with, so we're going to do that right now. And just take a minute and add a little green gold and let it flow. So I'm going to dilute a little bit in my palette here. I'm going to dilute a little green gold in my palette here, so I have kind of a watery mix of it just to start with. And then we're going to place that near my orchids, but not right up against them. So you can see there's a line there. And that's okay, we're not done yet. And I'm just going to flow it out by adding some water here and letting it spread. I don't want to have an edge there. And here where I do have an edge, now I can just carefully with my brush, and I don't have to be completely flawless and full of precision because I'm not, I'm an untidy painter, but I can come right up into my petals. And this is basically just clear water at this point. So I'm going to moisten right up against my flower. And over here, I'm going to actually overlap a little bit with that little spread of beautiful peachy pink that came out. Now, the Rose of Ultramarine does want to bleed a little bit, and that's okay, because that's going to actually help my painting look unified. Now I grab my pure green gold, and I'm going to dot in some of that pure pigment, and it's only going to dance across the places that I've already moistened. So I get this beautiful effect where the color pushes out. Adding that color now, the way I just did with that moist area, gives it the opportunity to look like it happened in the first layer. I also will go back to my Rose of Ultramarine, and I'm going to add a little bit of that as well. And that, I should dilute it a little bit. That's going to give us some fluidity that also adds to that first layer. Everything happened just naturally and effortlessly, and we didn't do any planning at all. So that's going to give us that illusion. And then we can also now have the opportunity to maybe add a hint more of that beautiful hue up here. Doesn't that look like a soft Calypso orchid? Just blurred out in the background, just like that. And add a little more of the orchid hue here. We want to keep it quite diluted. Our eyes are amazingly sensitive to variations in value and color. So we can really keep some of our areas diluted and soft. And still give the illusion of flowers and foliage and leaves off in the distance. Little pop of that green. I mentioned before about using pure pigment. You can see those little pure pigment bursts here. And then that gives that pure pigment the chance to move and flow out from that shape. And I'm also going to now think about painting some stems. Now these Calypso orchids do not have leaves around the flower head. So while leaves and foliage are fun to paint, I don't really get the chance to do that in this painting. Unless I want to work down in the forest floor. The other thing my reference photo tells me is that the stems are not green, which we often, I think, go to the green. They emerge from the back of the flower, and then they just pull straight down like so. And that doesn't look super beautiful when the whole rest of our painting is very soft. So here we have this very stiff stem, very crisp, not really adding to the effortless beauty of our painting. I'm using a sword brush right now. It gives me that opportunity to create that beautiful line. I'm also going to go in and add a new color. I'm grabbing the undersea green, touching in a little bit of the green gold. We are going to paint some darker value colors in here right now and give the look of that forest floor. And that's going to give us the chance to darken up our painting a little bit in a few areas. I don't want to overdo it. I think I want to keep this demonstration not super long and focused on simplicity. So then the challenge is not painting everything, I think. Now we have a little bead of color right here. I think I'm going to suck it up with my thirsty brush. And actually that's going to create a nice effect. I'm going to soften this area too. Sometimes when you paint a line, letting some of that line disappear, now that looks just a bit better. So I did two things that really worked well for me right here. Broke the line by adding some water and letting the color flow, and also added water into that paint before it dried. That actually channeled the pigment down and out. And so I have dark edges right in here, but lighter in the center where that fluidity channeled out. And isn't that beautiful? So now I have this beautiful soft stem here. We have some darker values down below. That kind of grounds our painting. I think it gives us beautiful balance. We have this lovely curve here. I was going to paint a stem for this hinted flower, a really soft stem. And I was going to also paint a stem for this flower. Kind of don't feel like they need them now. I feel like everything does look like it's connected and moving down toward this part of the painting. Really liking it actually. So I'm not going to fuss with it. I don't want to, I want to know when to leave well enough alone. I do want to add some distinction, some detail into the centers of my orchids. I like some of the dark values that are happening in my reference photo. So I've got some Rose of Ultramarine on my brush, and just looking closely, there's a little bit of line inside of the flower. Just blotting my brush so I can control the size of my lines. Something like that. And there's a few little freckle dots, so we could pounce those in. And there's a tiny bit of yellow, which I think we will use as well. I'm going to go to this unmarked yellow, which I think is cadmium yellow. The one color in my palette that did not get labeled. And that yellow, cadmium yellow, I can tell it's cadmium yellow because it's opaque. It pushes over top of the Rose of Ultramarine. I'm going to suck a little bit of it up with the thirsty brush. And still retains its identity. A color that can hold its own like that is definitely an opaque color. And cadmium yellow is an opaque color. Over here, we're going to do the same thing. A few little lines to just create detail with a fine pointed brush. If you don't have a sword brush, a rigger brush will do. Kind of thinking I might do a little bit here too. And maybe just a little line to indicate the cup of the flower. It's kind of damp down below here, so things stay soft. And up here, there's a pool of liquid right there that I don't like. I'm going to just blot it. And up here, I want to define these petals just a little bit more. So I'm just going to take my brush and place those 3 lines in there. Much too bold. No rush. Again, with my sword brush. And the round brush would work for this as well. Soften with a damp brush to let that bleed a little bit. It just helped define one side of that spiky petal and lets the other side be soft and flowing and pretty. So we get the best of both worlds. We get a little bit of crisp detail and a little bit of soft fluidity. And then everybody's happy. I'm not happy yet. I don't like this line that it's complete all the way down. I'm just going to soften it so it doesn't look quite so stark. Hard lines, edges are very visually demanding. They want the viewer to look that way. So if you have hard lines away from your focal point, they're going to pull the viewer away from the focal point of the painting. So it's just something to keep in mind, that the positioning, the placement of your hard edges should be in areas that support the focus of your painting, especially when you're painting loosely like this. There's a lot I could do to continue to add detail to this painting, but I really don't want to. I like the freshness and softness of the flowers. The only thing that I'll probably do is once this is dry, I will crop it. Any areas, like I have a lot of open space over here, so it might just look better if I take my mat and trim around the painting so that I'm really focused in on the focal point and don't have these flowers that look kind of like they're swimming and lost on this big piece of paper. One thing I could do that's always a little bit fun is just to take the opportunity to splash a little extra color on my painting with some spatter. So I'm gonna just see if we can do that here successfully. I'm using my sword brush because it's quite whippy, and just tapping it lightly. I'd rather tap too lightly and have to tap a lot than hit it hard once and have big bold splatters in the wrong place. Another color I really like, and it's kind of my go-to bonus color, is this cobalt teal. And so I'm going to dot in a little bit as an accent right now, like a crazy person, because I just can't resist. And I'm going to spatter a little bit of that on the painting as well. It'll just add a pop of color that'll bring a little playfulness to the painting. And I had a little cobalt teal splatter onto my blossom there. Didn't really like that, so I'm removing it. Just blotting it up. I actually teach 2 online watercolor courses on painting a loose and fluid floral style. I love painting flowers so much. I think there's such a great way to learn loose painting, to explore your interest in loose and abstract painting, and just to be more playful with watercolor. When we're painting loosely, we're exercising our power, our ultimate veto power as artists. We get to choose exactly what we want our painting to say, and the reference photo becomes only a suggestion, and that's really fun and really freeing. If you're interested in, thanks for watching, have fun painting flowers. They're your avenue and outlet for self-expression, just like they are mine. It just involves being willing to experiment, to share your love for watercolor, and to have fun.
Did this video inspire you? There's more where that came from. Enroll in lovely loose florals and discover your own loose floral painting style at learn.angelafair.com.